Good afternoon. It's good to see everyone out for another week in this spring term as we look at the history of Christianity for the first few centuries. I'm very excited about today's lecture. As usual, we have a lot to cover. We're going to pick up in the middle of the 3rd century, and if all goes well today, we'll be into the time of Constantine, which will then pave the way for our lecture next week, which will be our final one, in which we'll talk about the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed. I should just make a brief announcement before we begin, but it looks very positive that we will be continuing a class in the fall beginning in September. So I'll have more details for you next week on that, but that will likely actually relate to the New Testament. And I'm excited to pick our study of ancient Christianity back up and then look at the New Testament period and to do it in some significant depth. So more details on that to be forthcoming. So with that being said then, let's jump into the lecture for today. So today the schedule was to talk about Constantine and the Great Persecution. We're not quite there yet, but we're going to get there, then we'll get to the Great Persecution, and then to Constantine and what he does as the first Christian emperor. But just to return to a slide. So last week, as we talked about the 3rd century, I brought this slide up. And as you can see from this slide here, you quickly realize there are lots and lots of emperors in a very short space of only 50 years. And one of the things I would take from this is that this is a period of uncertainty. And it's rather, turbulent times when you look at how many emperors there are. They come, they might be killed, they might reign for a year or two, there's a usurper. And so there were some real challenges being faced by the larger Roman Empire in the 3rd century. As you kind of come out of the Severan dynasty, the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd. And as we see there, we have Numerian. We're actually going to look at his successor, Diocletian, in some detail. So he will reign for a couple decades and bring some stability to the Roman Empire, but also enact some things that will be very detrimental to the Christian church. So what I want to talk about as we begin today, I want to talk first about Decius. This is where we ended off last class, because it's with Decius's brief tenure as emperor that we have really an empire-wide persecution of Christians. And then I'm going to talk briefly about Valerian, who follows within a decade. And similarly, we have another persecution. Just kind of talk about the events that led to these and what we know about their respective tenures. So as I mentioned before with Decius, he assumes the office in about 249 or 250. And what he does is he issues, it was really unusual, there's been nothing like this before in Roman history. He issued an empire-wide edict that required everyone in the empire. The only group that was excluded were Jews, but this was, man, woman, child, slave and free, upper class, lower class, to go and make sacrifices to the traditional gods of Rome. And so there's lots of questions that revolve, again, in part because of the paucity of our sources. Why exactly does Decius do this? Was it because in 248 had been the 1000th anniversary of the Roman Empire, going back to the legendary founders Romulus and Remus, and so some have thought that perhaps it was an opportune time to go and do this for having they look at this kind of Roman Empire, the Roman state for now in existence for a millennium. That may have contributed to that. Something else that I think probably contributed, as we saw in our previous slide, that you have this series of emperor after emperor after emperor, and it was, in some respects, a fairly uncertain time. And so perhaps what was part of this was the thinking that, we need to go and propitiate the traditional gods. Things aren't going so well, and maybe Decius as the new emperor doesn't want to be an emperor just reigns for a very short period of time, presumably wants to have a long and prosperous reign. Think if he goes and has everybody propitiate the gods. Remember I talked in weeks past about this Roman idea of pax deorum, the peace of the gods, that if you go and propitiate them in the proper way, which is often done with sacrifice, could be done other ways also, that in return it was thought they would then ensure that whatever their divine jurisdiction might be, they might then ensure that would happen in a good way toward the populace. So somebody like, for example, right, Demeter, of course the Greek name of this god who is over agriculture, would then ensure, right, the crops would come and that there would be a good harvest, things like that. So he goes and he requires everyone to do this. Now, of course, as you can imagine, this is going to cause all kinds of problems for the Christians in the Roman Empire. And some have wondered, well, is this purely an anti-Christian measure? Again, as we get into the 3rd century, I think it's hard to imagine that Decius does not know something about the Christian church. Yes, it had been fairly obscure for the 1st century or so, but as you get into the early and mid-3rd century, certainly in the eastern half of the empire, and again, numbers are always very difficult to, as we wonder about, well, how many Christians were there? But there are estimates, at least in the east, Christians may have been approaching somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population. That may not seem like a lot, but actually that would be a very large population. Wondering if perhaps maybe this measure was directed against them. If it wasn't directly or exclusively, right, an anti-Christian measure, and it doesn't seem to be, based on the sources we have, certainly he's aware this is going to cause lots of problems. Now, what we know as we think about Eusebius, we're going to talk about him momentarily, he talks about this, but one of our primary sources for this edict and the consequences of this that was issued then in late 249, perhaps early AD 250, is a bishop called Dionysius of Alexandria. We don't have any of his writings extant. They're all preserved in fragmentary form, primarily in Eusebius. But Eusebius preserves a number of letters that this bishop wrote during this time. And he talks about the very difficult circumstances that Christians faced in Alexandria and larger Egypt when this edict arrived, and it was determined that, in fact, the prefect of Egypt would carry this out, and all inhabitants would then have to sacrifice. Let me just read this little brief excerpt from an eyewitness account from Dionysius, who talks about what happens in Egypt when this edict arrived. So, quote, "The edict arrived, and it was almost like that which was predicted by our Lord, well nigh the most terrible of all, so as, if possible, to cause to stumble even the elect," right? Because even members, in the church, right, some of them would refuse to sacrifice, or some of them would cave in sacrificing, for example, and this would then cause all kinds of problems. And he says, "Howsoever that be, all cowered with fear. And of the many of the more eminent persons, some came forward immediately through fear. Others in public positions were compelled to do so by their business, and others were dragged by those around them. Called by name, they approached the impure and holy sacrifices, some pale and trembling, as if they were not for sacrificing, but rather to be themselves the sacrifices and victims to the idols. So that the large crowd that stood around heaped mockery upon them, and it was evident they were by nature cowards in everything, cowards both to die and to sacrifice." So he's talking about a number of Christians immediately conceded and began offering sacrifices. Which, again, is going to cause some big problems in the church. This is kind of an act that's regarded tantamount to apostasy. But fearing, right, for their business, maybe in some case for their lives, a number begin doing this. Look what he says as he goes on. "But others ran eagerly towards the altars, affirming by their forwardness they had not been Christians even formerly, concerning whom the Lord very truly predicted, they shall hardly be saved." So, in fact, some altogether go and apostatize at this point, saying, we've never been Christians, we'll go and do this. "Of the rest, some followed one or other of these. Others fled. Some were captured. And of these, some went so far as bonds and imprisonment. And certain, when they had been shut up for many days, then forswore themselves even before coming into court, while others, who remained firm for a certain time under torture, subsequently gave in." So this puts the church and members in a very difficult circumstance, as we can see from the description of Dionysius, with some going and sacrificing, some going into hiding, some being put in prison, and then ultimately, right, in a state of weakness will go and make sacrifices. Now, what we have here, and this is a really interesting piece of evidence we have from this edict, is we have a series of what are called Decian libelli. And what we know that Decius required is that all people were to make this offering. And the way this took place is people would be called up. Imagine that people would probably use tax rolls in the government administration to find out who had made offerings, or at least use the tax rolls as a basis for going out and making sure that people had done this. And as proof that people had done this, they would then obtain a petition whereby witnesses, typically public magistrates, would say, I saw so-and-so making a sacrifice to the gods, or I saw so-and-so, right, partaking of the sacred offerings, right, to gods or goddesses, or pouring a libation. If you remember, some weeks ago when we talked about Pliny and the Christians in Pontus Bithynia, this is going back right to the beginning of the 2nd century, one of the things he said he made people do that said we've never been Christians is they went and made offerings to the gods. Because Pliny said, I understand real Christians can't do this. And what these libelli are, they're actual documents from the very period in question. Now, these don't necessarily come from Christians. They could, in fact, come from anybody, because, again, everybody was required to sacrifice. But it was only Christians that really had a big problem with this, right? Being monotheists, worshiping one God, not recognizing, right, the whole host of pagan deities. But as you can see there on the left side of your screen, there's a papyrus. It preserves the dates. This papyrus is actually written on a date corresponding with June 14th of AD 250. And it's addressed to public commissioners in a local city in Egypt. And it more or less says there's witnesses saying that they saw so-and-so along with his family or others go and make sacrifices, and therefore they fulfilled the requirement of the edict. Something we do know from Christian sources is that some Christians went and they actually had these things forged, saying they would get these things forged. So if anybody said, have you sacrificed? They'd say, oh, here my libellus is. And then they could say in good conscience, I didn't actually do this. And so we have remains of about 48 of these, but this is what they look like. But it's really quite interesting. However, in none of these can we actually say, well, this must have been a Christian who done this, because it doesn't actually mention Christians. It could be a regular individual. Now, Decius dies after just a couple years in office, and the edict comes to an end. And we read in Christian writings how there is a great sense of relief in the church at large now that this edict is no longer being enforced. However, there's a whole new problem now in the church, is you've had now a period of, in many respects, widespread apostasy. Right? People have gone, they have made sacrifices, and then what you also have is you have, on the other hand, you have people that no matter what, think of, for example, like Origen, for example, they did not offer a sacrifice, and they basically languished under very hard conditions in prison for a period of time. Now, our evidence, for this wake of the persecution of Decius, some of our best evidence comes from a bishop in North Africa, in Carthage, by the name of Cyprian. And I want to talk just a little bit about Cyprian for a few moments. He's a bishop for about a decade. He deals with the aftermath of the Decian persecution, and according to tradition, he'll actually be killed or martyred under Valerian, who will reinitiate persecution a few years later. And one of the things he does, he writes various treatises. We have letters of his, but we have a couple treatises. One of them is on the lapsed, or on the unity of the church. And what this has to do with is he's trying to now stitch back a very fragmented church. Because there's a lot of hard feelings there. Let me just give you an example. Try to imagine what's going on here in the church. Imagine, there's been a persecution. And let's say, imagine now that you, were maybe, you were faithful. You become, what you're going to have now is you have beginnings of a group of Christians, a kind of class almost, that are called confessors, which means they confess in times of persecution. And they'll be regarded, at least more and more, as we get into the great persecution. But let's say you have somebody now that perhaps has lost maybe their property, undergone extreme hardship, maybe languished in prison for months or even beyond a year because they refused to sacrifice, and it's now that this Decian persecution is over, and they're in a congregation. And let's say somebody, went and they said, fine, I'll sacrifice, even though I really don't mean it, and effectively then nothing happens to them. And these two now are sitting across the aisle each other in church. Well, you can imagine there can be some hard feelings here. And so one of the things that Cyprian does in his treatise on the lapsed is he does make an argument saying, look, these people that did basically deny the faith and recant their faith under duress, there is still hope for them. In fact, there is a movement among some Christians saying, no, once you deny the Lord effectively this way, there is no hope for you. In fact, they'll use various passages like some in Hebrews that are you can read them certainly in this respect. And so he has kind of this more moderate position saying, no, we got to let them back in. We need to have unity in the church. And so a lot of his writings then deal with this, but there is a big problem. There's some real schisms going on. In fact, one of the big schisms we won't have time to talk about has to do with the bishopric in Rome. In fact, another bishop says, well, this bishop wasn't faithful, therefore he has lost his authority. And you have an anti-bishop, so you have two bishops actually competing with one another. This is not unusual, this will go on elsewhere also. Ultimately, Cyprian will die in later persecution under Valerian. But really, for this period, if you look at this Decian persecution, our primary sources are really Dionysius of Alexandria, and then Cyprian, where we do have some of his treatises, are extant. Now, as we move into this period of Valerian, right, so you have Decius, and then Valerian will take over. He'll reign for about 7 years. And we do know from Cyprian and some other sources that, in fact, he does issue some edicts against the church. Now, doesn't seem to be quite as empire-wide, like everybody has to sacrifice. Doesn't require everybody in the empire to do this, but he will go and require, in fact, he wants Christians specifically to recognize the Roman ceremonies. And so what he does here in his first edict is, under penalty of banishment, Christians cannot gather together in churches or meet in cemeteries. One of the things Christians might do occasionally is meet in cemeteries to, in some sense, venerate martyrs or those who have died previously. And so this is one edict that's made against the church. We know of another edict, for example, that Christians of the upper classes need to forfeit their property. And if they persist in the faith, well, they're to be executed. And so in this case, the tradition is that Cyprian actually will lose his life. Again, we don't know of all the reasons behind why he does this, but he does take some very drastic measures against the church. Something that's really interesting is we do have a couple documents. I'll just show this one right here. It's a really fascinating text because it's actually, again, an eyewitness text from the time of Valerian. When you look at this here, this is another papyrus. It preserves a date, so it was written on a date corresponding with February 28th, 256. And what you have there is this text. Underneath, then, I have a transcription of the Greek. But let me just read this for you. Let's just talk about this. And it takes place under Valerian. So it says, right, beginning here, at the start, I'll put the arrow right here. So it says, from the presidency to the comarchs and the epistates of peace. And so what it's saying is from like a local, right, presidency or somebody who's ruling locally, to the comarchs and basically the officers of peace. So these comarchs and officers of peace are basically ancient police. You don't really have an ancient police force, so to speak. You have people who are in charge of maintaining peace. So it's addressed to those. And it says, of the village of Myrmurtha, this is a village in Egypt. And it says, immediately send up a man called Pedoserapis. It's an Egyptian, right? Pedoserapis literally means Egyptian. He who belongs to Serapis, son of Horus. And then it says this. Look what it says here. Who is, what it actually says in the papyrus, it says he's a Chrysianon, but it actually meant he's a Christian. And it says, or you yourselves come up. And then it says year 3 of Valerian and Gallienus Augustus on famine 03. So we know that this date now corresponds with February 28th, 256. So it's interesting, right? There is kind of this order to go and have this person, right, Pedoserapis, son of Horus, who is a Christian, taken into custody. Now, the way I read this would probably presume that, in fact, here is some act where this person is well known in the village as a Christian, and they're going to go and take him. And I would associate then with some act of persecution. What's interesting here, when you look at this name, Pedoserapis, I find this interesting. When you look at the ancient world, they'll often have all kinds of unusual names. They often names tell you something in many cases about people's religion. For example, right, the same Pedoserapis, he who belongs to Serapis. And so when I read this, I would imagine this person was probably born, right, an Egyptian, right, but born probably in a traditional Egyptian family, but at some point becomes a Christian. I think I would have a hard time, right, Christians saying, well, I'm going to have a Christian, I'm going to name my child the one who belongs to Serapis. That's a theophoric name, worshiping the god Serapis. So probably in this case, this person was probably a convert to the church at some point. So it's kind of interesting what names can tell you. But you can have a Christian whose name is this, and yet they're known as a Christian. Maybe also because they're known as a Christian, maybe they were part of the clergy. And maybe there is then this act here of we're seeing here, just getting a little snapshot from, one day in 256 where a clergyman was actually going and being arrested. Potentially, this is one way to read this text, but it's really quite fascinating. Well, as we return to Valerian, things don't end so well for him. Valerian tenure will come to an end rather dramatically One of the things I haven't talked about, and I'll just mention in passing, is that the Roman Empire at this time had a very difficult time on the eastern frontier with the Parthians or the Persians. And there were lots of skirmishes, right? And there were kind of lines drawn in the sand and boundaries about where one empire ended, another began. But they were constantly fighting over this, and there were various incursions both ways. Well, Valerian went out to go and to oversee and to basically campaign against the Persians, and he will ultimately be captured by the Persian monarch, Shapur I, and will basically be taken into captivity. This is unusual in some ways for this happen to a Roman Empire, and basically will be treated as a slave to this Persian monarch and will die in captivity. And so some Christians, of course, will then look at this as basically saying, this was divine retribution for what he had done. He got his just deserts, he's now a slave, and it talks about the horrible things that take place to him before he will ultimately die in Persia. But that brings an end, anyway, to two episodes that take place in about a decade apart, but are quite significant there in the middle of the 3rd century. What we're going to see as we move forward about another half century is when we get into the first part of the 4th century, we have another very intense persecution called the quote-unquote Great Persecution. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But now returning more generally to the 3rd century. If you remember last week, I showed this slide of some very notable Christian writers who lived during this time. One final one I want to talk about now, and this has really kind of paved the way as we begin talking about the Great Persecution, as well as the time of Constantine. It's a very important Christian writer called Eusebius of Caesarea. I've actually quoted him a number of times and talked about his church history, so I think now it's time for me to say a couple words about him and why he was such an important figure in Christianity of his day. Sometimes Eusebius is called the quote-unquote Christian Herodotus. Now, if you're wondering who Herodotus was, many people really regard him, certainly in the Western tradition, as the father of history. He writes this history, right, that goes back, right, during the Persian period. And the Greek word history, right, our word history, comes from this word historia in Greek, which means inquiry, where you're asking questions about what is going on. And Eusebius was very interested about Christian history. In fact, one of the reasons why he gets dubbed this title, right, the Christian Herodotus, is because he writes the first extant history of the Christian church up to his own day. In fact, you might well all be familiar with B.H. Roberts' History of the Church. Well, believe it or not, B.H. Roberts actually consciously modeled his history on the church on the history that Eusebius will write. In fact, it's very clear he's aware of that to some degree and will certainly model aspects on that. So let's then talk about Eusebius and what his contribution was then to the early church. So he's born, right, sometime after the reign of Valerian. He's called Eusebius of Caesarea because in the ancient world there's many people that bear this name. And he was here in this, basically, resided in this seaside town, Caesarea. This is the same Caesarea you read about in Acts chapter 10 where Peter has a vision, right, that the gospel can go to, right, the Gentiles with Cornelius. This is the same Caesarea where Paul's going to be imprisoned in for a time in Acts 24 through 26. This important seaside town, which is called actually Caesarea Maritima, which means Caesarea on the sea. And eventually he'll actually become the bishop of this city. Well, one of the things that Eusebius is very well known, for, and here maybe you're thinking a connection now to Origen. Origen, as we talked about last week, will ultimately relocate to Caesarea after a time in Egypt. And Origen establishes a large library there, and Eusebius will basically continue to grow this library and oversee it in large part for the first part of his career. And Eusebius becomes a very prolific church writer. Not nearly so as much as Origen, but he writes an awful lot. And what's nice about Eusebius is that in large part his writings have been preserved. And so he writes a number of different writings, and so I want to talk about some of these. Without a doubt, his most influential writing, at least as we think about the last 1700 years, has been his ecclesiastical history. And what he was up to in this ecclesiastical history is he writes this in 10 books, and he begins with the time of Christ. In fact, he even starts with the pre-existence of Christ, talking about the Logos, picking up with the imagery that you have in John 1, and goes and talks about the early church, what happened in the days of the apostles, has all kinds of stories, and of course that then goes up to the 2nd, the 3rd century into his own day. And the final book ends right around 324, right before the Council of Nicaea. And one of the things that's very valuable about this work, although he's been criticized for a variety of reasons, in some cases I think unfairly, is that he will draw on a number of sources that are no longer extant. So he'll talk about, for example, Dionysius of Alexandria, and quote letters saying, look what happened during Decius. He'll quote, eyewitness reports, and otherwise Dionysius' letters are no longer around. He'll talk about Christians like Hegesippus, that were apparently prominent in the 2nd century, and others, and give quotes from their treatises, which again, otherwise are no longer around. So he really provides a framework for us to help understand the history of Christianity for the first 300 years. In fact, I would argue that for better or worse, this is really all we have to some degree. And so if you're going to try to reconstruct a history of Christianity, without a doubt you're going to be reading this work, his Ecclesiastical History. And there are many translations of this work available online that you can go and access for free. Now, let me talk about some of his other works. So the Ecclesiastical History is the big one. And by the way, other church historians will then pick up after that in the 5th and 6th century, and this will become more of a genre. We want to write history of what's going on in our respective periods. But something else that Eusebius done, and this is actually really quite novel, is what he does, right, is he is a reader, an avid reader of all kind of sources, he is one of the first people to put together a chronicle of world history. What he wanted to do for Christians is say, look, we have this biblical history that goes back where you have patriarchs, right? You have Abraham, Isaac, Moses. And what he tries to do in this chronicle that he puts together, which is only extant in a much later Latin translation, is he begins now assigning dates to various biblical events, and he ties them in some cases with what's known as the cycle of the Olympiads. You're probably all aware the Olympiad is a 4-year cycle that begins in the year 776 BC. And so he will tie an event saying, look what happened. So in this Olympiad, this is when they went into exile. For dates before that, he obviously can't use Olympiads when he talks about the patriarchs and things like that, but where he can relate biblical history to this, he will use this Olympiad cycle, and he will make notes as you read different histories, right, of Manetho from Babylon, or Egyptian histories, things like this. And so it's really a rather remarkable work. When you think about this chronicle, if you get here, when you get down, for example, to the 202nd Olympiad, which would correspond with AD 29 to 32, he talks now saying this is now the beginning of the announcement of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so in part, when you think about how we date, right, Christ, one of the ways we can do is look back, well, what does Eusebius say in his chronicle? And so you go through and you can kind of figure out, when you factor in the Olympiads, what years he assigns certain things. And it's really quite a remarkable work. It's a shame it hasn't survived, but only in a Latin translation. Something else that Eusebius does, and this can become more clear here as we proceed in the lecture today, is that Eusebius personally knew Constantine. In fact, Eusebius really liked Constantine because for Eusebius, Constantine really puts an end to this persecution in Rome. And so Eusebius is going to write a work called The Life of Constantine, which is really a flattering panegyric. Panegyric means kind of he lists all the works that Constantine does. And clearly, right, it really goes well beyond flattery. In fact, Eusebius almost comes across as a sycophant. But in fact, we now learn a ton about the life of Constantine from this work. And we learn about various things that he does and his mother does. In fact, the life of Constantine, as we'll see next week, is one of our primary sources for what happens at the Council of Nicaea. And so it's a very useful work that has survived. Something else that he does, which is very interesting, is he writes a number of exegetical works. So like Origen, he writes commentaries, right, on the Psalms or on Scripture. He writes letters to people that try to answer gospel problems. Or, for example, various letters where he says, well, some people read this as a contradiction in Scripture. Here's how I would explain that. He writes a very important work that is still extant today. It's called the Onomasticon. And what this is Eusebius, much as he tries to put biblical history in a concrete historical narrative, he says, where are all these places that are mentioned in the Old Testament. Of course, Jerusalem is still around, but there's various places, right, that may have been mentioned in the Old Testament that people are wondering, where is this today? So being in Caesarea, he went around and he made a catalog of where it was believed various places were. And it's called an onomasticon. It gives names to biblical places and talks about what was going on in the 4th century or the end of the 3rd century at that place. And in fact, believe it or not, a lot of, Bible dictionaries today or gazetteers are either directly or indirectly related to this work. It's the work of Eusebius. And it's really quite a remarkable work. Here is a sample page in translation where he talks about different places and gives a description of them. Now, I didn't visit them all, but certainly those in the Holy Land he had visited and talks about them. And what's interesting is this little descriptions. Well, there's a church there nowadays. People go and think this happened here, this event of Jesus happened there. And so it's really a very important work. Something else that I want to mention about Eusebius that is quite important is last week and in the previous weeks I talked about some ancient Bibles, right? Our two most ancient Bibles that date to the 4th century are called Codex Sinaiticus in the British Library today and Codex Vaticanus in the Vatican. And there is a chance that in fact these were actually written by Eusebius. Now, when I say Eusebius, he was basically put in charge of putting these together for Constantine. We have a letter in the life of Constantine where Constantine writes Eusebius a letter saying, look, I need some new Bibles, and these are for the churches in the newly founded Constantinople. And so Eusebius is put in charge of overseeing the production of 50 very fine Bibles that will then ultimately be sent to Constantinople and for churches there. And so some have wondered if perhaps these two old Bibles may perhaps be among some of those that were produced in Caesarea. Again, we can't be certain totally, but that may be the case. If that is the case, that's really quite remarkable. Now, something else that Eusebius does, and this is going to lead me now into, and it'll serve as a segue for our discussion of the Great Persecution, is like Origen, and like many ancient Christian writers, he was an apologist. Okay, now an apologist, right? This apologia is he would give a defense for Christianity. And he does this in a few works in particular. So he writes a work, for example, called the Preparatio Evangelica, where he talks about, well, the preparation for the gospel. What happened before? Why did the gospel come at that time? One of the criticisms that non-Christians make of Christians at the time is they say, look, your religion is new. Even at this point, it's only been around a couple hundred years, or we can go back hundreds and hundreds of years for traditional Greek and Roman religion. And one of the things that Eusebius will do is say, look, in fact, the gospel is much older in various forms. He will talk about the law and how that fits in, how the Savior came at an ideal moment in human history. In this respect, I think this is rather interesting, certainly from our Latter-day Saint, right, perspective as we look at history providentially. Let me just give some context for this. So one of the things that Eusebius claims here, he says, look, it was no accident that Jesus came along during the reign of Augustus. Augustus had put an end to, civil war and all kinds of problems, brought about what's known as the quote-unquote Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, which is surely some political propaganda, but there's certainly something to this. And he's saying he came along at the ideal time where there was peace. He could preach. His disciples could then move and do things they couldn't have done at any other period in world history. And he says this in such a way where I think that, there is something, certainly I would think something to this. Much as we might say today that we think events that maybe transpired before the Restoration, if you think like Reformation, things like that, we would say this was providential and needed to happen before Restoration. Eusebius will do something similar in this work, and so I think it's rather interesting on a number of levels. He will then write a work, The Demonstration of the Gospel, which kind of articulates the Gospel in more detail, and then what he does, he writes a work against a person called Hierocles. We've already read a work, right, or we talked about a work, I should say, that Origen wrote against a man called Celsus. Well, at this point, there was a government official named Hierocles that had circulated a treatise trying to attack Jesus. And what we see as we move at the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 4th century, we're going to see a very intense period and rise of anti-Christian literature, which in some ways will contribute and culminate in a very severe persecution against Christians that's going to take place at the start of the 4th century. And I'm going to talk more about this. I think it's no coincidence then that you see Eusebius addressing some of this, because what we find, and I think it's probably the case in the modern period today, that often persecution is often, in many cases, preceded by some kind of anti-literature that begins to attack. And so Eusebius then will address this. We'll say more about that momentarily. Now what this will do is it's going to segue now into our discussion of the quote-unquote Great Persecution. And this was a very big and significant persecution that took place against Christians, really beginning in earnest at the start of the 4th century, 302, 303, that officially lasted till 305, but actually it goes on for much longer in the East. And so let me talk about what contributed to that, and then we're going to talk about the persecution itself and what we know about this, because what will come out of the persecution, of course, is we're going to see Constantine here within a decade, right, take some very important steps to put an end to this, and ultimately will consolidate the empire and become the first Christian emperor. So as I mentioned before, right, the 3rd century was a tough time, as you can see here from the slide that I've already shown a couple of times. Well, what we have is when Numerian dies, we have an officer who served in his court named Diocletian, who will ultimately take over. And he will rule for about 2 decades. And by the way, if you've ever heard of the phrase, right, the later Roman Empire or the Byzantine period, in many cases, historians say the Byzantine, the quote-unquote Byzantine period, that really now begins with Diocletian, and in part because he makes a number of reforms to the Roman Empire. Now, before we talk about some of the reforms that he makes, he was a native of Dalmatia, right, modern-day Yugoslavia. As I mentioned before, he's a commander, right, in the bodyguard of the Emperor Numerian. And he will take over, right? There's a usurper. Numerian's brother wants to take over, but he will be victorious there. And one of the things that he wants to do is he's recognized that basically for the last 50 years, Roman, leadership, politics, with all this succession of rulers, has been very turbulent. And he wants to put an end to this. And this is, when you think about this, right, think about this, right, Roman rule. If you have an emperor, right, and they rule for a time, things can be fairly stable. But if people are dying or being killed in rapid succession, it becomes a very unstable period, especially because what often will happen in the 3rd century is somebody gets killed, and then there's now more civil wars as people now vie for power. And so he wants to put an end to this. And so one of the things he does now that will really change the complexion of the Roman Empire administratively is he introduces what's known as the Tetrarchy. He realizes now in many ways that basically the Roman Empire is too big for one man to rule. And there's too many problems if that person dies. And so he says we need to kind of divide the power and create some separation of powers. And what he does basically is he divides the empire basically into 2, but kind of subdivides it into 4, and there'll be a ruler over each part of the empire, right? A tetrarchy or a 4th. And so this first tetrarchy that he then installs is there will be what's called an emperor or an Augustus in the east and in the west. What you're going to see here is going to happen. You're seeing this in the church in the 4th century. In part, this is informed by this decision here, is this growing divide between, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. Well, this is where in some ways it's getting its beginnings here. He says, okay, I'm going to be the emperor, right, in the east, and there's going to be an emperor in the west, right? He appoints a man called Maximian. Underneath them, who will be looking over a certain area in the east or in the west, we're going to appoint 2 others who will serve as Caesars. So in the east, under him was a man called Galerius. The Caesar under Maximian was called Constantius. Now, you know where I'm going on this, right? Because Constantius' son will actually be Constantine. This is how Constantine will ultimately get to power, and he's actually going to abolish this thing in a couple decades. But we'll get there in due course. And so what you have is this division, something like this, where, for example, Constantius kind of rules over Britain, right, and Gaul, and the empire is divided like this. And so you have this tetrarchy that's now installed. And again, part of this is to kind of bring things under control. So, for example, if somebody suddenly dies, there's not a huge power struggle. A Caesar can replace an emperor, or a Caesar can then just be replaced. And this might sound good in theory, and it works for a time under Diocletian for about 2 decades, but ultimately, as we're going to see, it's really going to crumble, and there will then, of course, be one person ruling. That will ultimately be Constantine. Now, what we have during this period, this tetrarchy, is I mentioned before we have a rise in anti-Christian literature. So I talked about Eusebius, how he writes a treatise against a man called Hierocles, who wrote a treatise against Jesus and against Christianity. But as I mentioned before, we have kind of the remains of three anti-Christian treatises from antiquity. The first one was Celsus. The second one was by a philosopher named Porphyry, who, as far as we can tell, writes the most comprehensive attack on Christianity. There are only fragments of this left, but basically Porphyry will go in and he will attack Christianity on a variety of levels. But what I think you're seeing here is he starts doing this and others, and I think with Diocletian seeing some of this stuff going on, this kind of will serve in many ways as a prelude for the Great Persecution. Probably not unlike the period of Decius, where they say, look, we're trying to get this empire back on track. There's problems going on. We have this group that are, we perceive as troublemakers. These Christians who don't worship our gods, don't do the things we should do. Remember, in the ancient world, there's no such thing as separation of church and state, right? It's one and the same. And so they look upon this. There's this literature coming out. And so you're seeing this rise of this. So he writes this, right? Probably comes out near the end of the 3rd century. There's an interesting story that we also see that will serve as a prelude to the Great Persecution, is Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, says, in fact, that what you have is during this tetrarchy, there was a deliberate attempt by the government to indoctrinate people against Christianity. And look what he says here, that actually was being taught in the schools at the time. He says this, quote, having forged, to be sure, memoirs of Pilate and our Savior, full of every kind of blasphemy against Christ, with the approval of their chief, they sent them around to every part of his dominions. With edicts they should be exhibited openly for everyone to see in every place, both town and country, and that the primary teacher should teach them to children instead of lessons, for study and committal to memory. So Eusebius says at this time, says, look, in this anti-Christian campaign, the government began then circulating, quote, acts of Pilate and the Savior, right, to recount what these acts likely were, saying, look, here's the real account of what happened with Jesus and Pilate. And of course, this was a much later forgery, but they circulate this then to undercut Christian claims, both about Jesus and things that allegedly went on about him. And the government is actually sponsoring this. And Eusebius then writes a response to this. He talks about this in his history and then combats this and says, look, these things are clearly forgery because the dates don't even add up. But you're seeing here, interesting, right, how the government will then start taking a very strong propaganda campaign against the church. Now what this is going to culminate in as we get into the year 302, 303, is we look at Diocletian, and there's now this story given by an ancient Christian writer called Lactantius. And let me talk about Lactantius for just a moment. I'm just going to digress here for a moment. He's an important Christian writer. His life overlaps, right, the later part of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century. He is from North Africa. He's really an apologist. He writes in Latin, converts to Christianity, and is made a teacher, right, under Diocletian in Nicomedia, which is now the eastern capital. However, with the beginnings of this persecution, he loses his post, as do many Christians at that point. Ultimately was going to make his way to Trier, right, in Gaul, and will become a tutor for the oldest son of Constantine. But he writes various treatises, and these are the two most notable that have survived. In fact, I want to make a note here on this second treatise on the deaths of the persecutors of, right, basically the Christians. And what this is, he writes this in a period where, Constantine has now come to power. And it goes back and gives us history basically saying that whatever emperor had set their hand to attack the church ended up with a very, very bad fate. Now, I bring this up here because I think there's an interesting connection here. You may not realize it with Latter-day Saint history. Some of you may be aware there was actually a book published, it's now going on many, many decades ago, called On the Deaths of the Persecutor of the Prophet Joseph Smith, that contains all kinds of stories about what allegedly happened to those who were there at Carthage jail and were part of the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. Again, it's not altogether clear who the author of this work was, but whoever this author of this work was, it's very clear they had read Lactantius, which is very interesting, because they clearly model it on this treatise of his. And in this treatise, we learn an awful lot about what goes on during this great persecution. And so I just wanted to introduce him briefly as we then read what he says here. So he says this is how this thing really got going in AD 303. What happened is Diocletian was in the east, and he said that Diocletian, like many leaders at the time, they would rely for decisions on soothsayers and augury. And what augury was, basically, it's kind of like reading tea leaves, so to speak. But in that case, what they do in the ancient world is people would go and they would, sacrifice an animal, and they would then go and read the entrails of the animal and say, well, based on this entrails, these things are going to happen. And so the story that Lactantius gives, he says, look, that Diocletian was thoroughly involved in this, and that one day, right, they were doing this, and those augurs who were reading, right, the entrails of animals said, we can't do this. Something's not working here. We lost our power. And according to the story that's given by Lactantius, it was allegedly because there were Christians there in the presence of what was going on, and they weren't able to do this. And Diocletian becomes very, very angry when this accusation is made, well, we can't do this because there's Christians here, they don't worship the gods are offended. This is kind of the first real act that then results in this very horrific persecution. And one of the first things he does, he begins first of all saying, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to clean out the army of Christians. It's very clear that as we get into the late 3rd, early 4th century, there are, in not insignificant numbers, Christians serving in the military. And so what he does, he goes about and he begins, first of all, demoting people who confess to being Christians in the military, removing them from office. If they don't recant in some cases, he even has them put to death. Again, I find this very interesting, and I think hopefully as I'm saying this, you're kind of resonating, perhaps with wondering how things in the modern world sometimes turn out. He goes and he begins making a systematic attempt to remove these people from their offices. Now what we get here, as we get into the early part of 303, he issues his first edict against the Christian church. And there hadn't been an edict issued like this previously, at least as far as we are aware. And so what does he do? He says that he wants all churches to be destroyed throughout the empire. The scriptures are to be collected and destroyed, and Christians of the upper classes are to lose their privileges. I assume that he's thinking here, if we go destroy churches, they can no longer meet. And in fact, as part of this edict, we know of a number of cases where, in fact, scriptures are consigned to the flames. I know you think of book burning maybe as a medieval campaign, but in fact, this already has a precedent already in the Roman period. It's really, you have book burning before this, but really during this period, Christian scriptures are being sought out and are being consigned to the flames, as are other texts. And we have this very notable story by Lactantius who says that at this point, remember we talked before about the 3rd century, there were now Christian purpose-built churches. There was apparently a very large church in the city of Nicomedia. And here, Diocletian says this church needs to be destroyed. The soldiers want to go and burn it down, but they're fearful that if they start it on fire, that it will catch other part of the cities. So they go and they come forward with axes and swords, and they basically hack down the church so that there is nothing left of this. And that was kind of the first act. And of course, then there are other churches that will then be destroyed. I won't go into detail in this papyrus here, but it's a very fascinating text where it actually talks about an edict talking about a church that had been destroyed in Egypt and the inventory that was then taken for that church. And so this was the first edict, right, that then churches, right, be destroyed, and scriptures and things like that are to be consigned to the flames. What you then have is you go to the second edict. What do we have here? Well, all leaders, bishops, right, are to be arrested and to be compelled to sacrifice. And so you have now a number of leaders of churches now are now put in prison. This is not unlike what we saw during the reign of Decius. And so leaders are put in prison. And remember we talked about Dionysus, all the things that happened there, people fleeing, all of that. The same things go on once again. And there's a number of problems that are going to arise because of this. And we'll talk about some of those next week. The other edicts we know that take place during this great persecution is that once they were sacrificed or even compelled to sacrifice, there are stories of Christians actually literally being grabbed by the hand, taking their hand, reaching in and making a libation or something to a god or goddess could then be free. But then eventually the fourth one was, if they don't do this of their own accord, they will be put to death. And so we do know of a number of martyrs at this time who are put to death and who will not recant. Okay? Now, not all of them are, but some of them are. In fact, like other edicts, some will just end up languishing in prison. And it's really here where now this, as I've mentioned before, this group called the confessors, they will really begin to take a very important role in the church. Those that under times of duress and hardship refuse to sacrifice, to refuse to give in, maybe were tortured, maybe languish in prison. When this is over, they'll be viewed with a great respect within the church. In fact, one of the things we know goes on, and this is quite horrific, but actually goes on at this period, and we learn this from Eusebius, that a number of people who were basically condemned to death were damned to the mines, which at those period resulted in certain death. But when you read this passage, it's rather barbaric. But one of the things that happens is that some people were then, Christians were condemned to the mines. They had, in fact, one of their eyes gouged out and their leg basically seared and cut, so they were basically lame the rest of their life. And as we'll talk about next week, these confessors, right, that undergo these very harsh tortures that survive are accorded with great esteem. So at the Council of Nicaea, in fact, there's a confessor named Paphnutius that actually is there, who has actually his right eye is missing, and Constantine shows him a tremendous amount of respect for what he underwent in this horrific persecution. Now, what happens as we move forward, right? This persecution is really intense for about a 3-year period. And eventually Diocletian will get sick, right? He's getting on in age. And so what happens now is this tetrarchy, right? He will eventually, right, abdicate, and the Caesars will then take over. And this is kind of unusual, right? Historically, what happens with the emperor, right, is you kind of die in office, but now he leaves, right? He goes into retirement in Dalmatia into a palace that he has there. Here is a depiction of what that may have looked like. And what you now have is the new emperor in the west is Constantius. The Caesar underneath him is Valerius Severus. Galerius now is ruling the east, and under him is Maximinus. Now, of course, we're now going to get into Constantine. And how does now Constantine make a rise in this tetrarchy and ultimately destroy this tetrarchy and become the sole emperor? This is a very interesting story that we're at least going to introduce today, and we're going to continue next week, and will lead us into the Council of Nicaea. Now, one of the things you have in this tetrarchy, as we look here, is they realized early on that in fact people might not trust each other. So it was determined, and I'll give the example here, that in the case of Galerius and Constantius, is that Constantius's family, in large part, would go and live in the east under Galerius, and Galerius's family would go and live in the west under Constantius. The thinking was that, for example, if Constantius ever had any thought saying, I want to go and encroach on his territory, or I want to go and overthrow him, I won't do this because my family is living there and he'll hurt them. So Constantine, who is the son of Constantius, actually grows up in the east in the court of Galerius. And the story about Constantine is Constantius was a soldier and initially married a woman called Helena. This is his mother. You've probably heard of Saint Helen. Well, this is the mother of Constantine. And he, has her as a wife. It's kind of basically whether it's a wife or basically something like common law or a girlfriend. And she becomes pregnant. She bears Constantine. But when he gets elevated under Diocletian and becomes a Caesar, he immediately gets rid of Helena because she's of low birth. And he marries a more noble lady called Theodora, who will actually bear him more children. But regardless, Constantine will then grow up in the east. He is there. And the story that goes is that he really wants to go and he wants to see his father. He hasn't seen him for a long time, right? They've had letters, there's exchanges. He wants to go and see Constantius, who is there in the west. And he asks Galerius, can I go? Can I go? And Galerius, I think, is smart, saying, no, you can't go because you're like this important bargaining chip, right? You're the firstborn son of the emperor. Certainly he would never do anything because I have you here in my palace. Well, the story that's given is that Galerius says, okay, you can go to your father. But the story is that he was going to change his mind in the morning. But that night, basically, Constantine escapes from the palace, gets on horses, and begins riding right to various stations, changing horses, and literally in a matter of a few days, and this is unheard of in the ancient world, travels over 1,000 miles and goes and meets his father, who's in Bononia in northern Italy. And before Galerius realizes this, he's already escaped. Now, of course, what's going to happen is his father immediately elevates him. This is now going to be where this tetrarchy begins to fall apart. Because what's going to happen now is Constantius will eventually go back to Britain. He's going to die there within a year's time. And again, the successor in the tetrarchy, right, should be Severus. Now, Severus is going to die shortly thereafter. But while there, Constantine is then made the emperor at York in AD 306. And so here, what you're seeing here is really this tetrarchy now in large parts being ignored. And of course, that's going to get Galerius, then his co-emperor Licinius, very angry. Who is Constantine, this usurper? Who does he think he is? He's now taken over. This is not what was set in place. So through a series of negotiations, I won't go into all the details here, what will emerge then in the next couple of years, Severus dies, is it's agreed then that Galerius will rule with Licinius in the east, a man called Maxentius will rule in the west, and underneath them will be Maximius Daia, and then the Caesar in the east, who's under Maxentius, will be Constantine. And Constantine then rules in Gaul. But what we're going to see here very shortly is Constantine and Maxentius begin fighting with one another, and ultimately will have a very significant battle known as the Battle of Milvian Bridge that will take place in October of AD 312. But before we get there, something significant does happen. When we get into the year AD 311, we have this edict that's made, and Lactantius mentions this, and this is called an Edict of Toleration. And what this Edict of Toleration is basically is that persecution that went on against the Christians, it was really intense for a period of 2 or 3 years. It's still going on in some respects in the East. That now, a stop needs to be put to that. And now, this is really interesting, this is the first official act of toleration of Christians in the Roman Empire. And some have wondered if perhaps now that Constantine's in the Tetrarchy, has he in some way influenced this? And so you can look at this text as it's preserved by Lactantius, where it says Christians will be tolerated. They may go, they may reassemble, as long as they do nothing contrary to good order. So by no means to say, well, Christianity is, the religion, but it can be one of others, but it now deserves to be tolerated. In fact, when you read this, it is in some kind of condescending language to Christianity, but this is a big, big step. In fact, one of the ironies you see in the 4th century is Christianity starts out in the 4th century being the persecuted with the Great Persecution, and will end the 4th century with Theodosius being the persecutor. Going out, and then, just as churches were destroyed at the beginning of the 4th century, it will go out, and through official orders and edicts and directions by bishops, it will be the one now burning down temples and doing things like this. So it's really quite remarkable what will take place in just a century. But anyway, this is a very important edict, and it's one of toleration. Now, what takes place is that, as I said before, we have, Maxentius and Constantine are in the west, and they begin fighting with one another. And what ultimately happens through a series of battles, Constantine is very effective. It seems that soldiers like him. He's not scared to get his hands dirty and go right into battle, is he will eventually drive the forces of Maxentius all the way down to Rome. And basically, Maxentius just kind of locks himself in the city of Rome, If you go to Rome today, you'll see, like all ancient cities, the walled city of these walls of Aurelian, who was an emperor back in 274, and is kind of waiting it out. And the story that's given is that basically Maxentius inquires of, an augur, or a soothsayer, and says, what should we do? And the story that's given on that side is saying, well, go out and fight against the army of Constantine. And so what he does here is he's going to go out, open the gates, and the soldiers will spill out, and there will be this big battle known as the Battle of Milvian Bridge, as you can see here, that's over the Tiber. And what's going to happen in this battle is that basically Maxentius and his forces will be totally routed. Maxentius will be killed and beheaded, and Constantine will now come into Rome triumphant, and will now be the sole emperor, now is what you have, in the west. And of course, then he's going to turn his way east, and he's going to take over everything eventually. But we'll get to that next week. But something I want to end with today is what's alleged by Christians, both Lactantius and Eusebius, is they say that on the eve of this battle, Constantine has allegedly a vision. This is why I have what you see here, this picture here of Constantine, of this Latin, in hoc signo vinces. So, in this sign you conquer. So the story that's given, and the story doesn't agree entirely between Eusebius and Lactantius, is that on the eve of this battle, Constantine has a vision wherein he sees, some say a cross, although it doesn't actually appear like that, but what appears based on what's described here is a cross-like shape, something like this, which could be taken here, as a chi, the Greek letter, the beginning of Christos, and with a loop on the top, which could be like a chi rho for, the first 2 letters of Christos. And so what's happened allegedly is he has this vision, and he's told if the soldiers put this on their standards, they will be victorious. And what you will then notice then, and this is why I say the cross then will be, various forms will become far more important post-Constantine, because really, as I said before, we don't see a lot of this before this time. But there's this vision allegedly has this, and so you can see, for example, one of the earliest depictions from a very famous sarcophagus in Rome, where you see it right there in the center. This is probably just a couple decades later. So using this symbol, he goes in and he's victorious. Now what I'm going to talk about next week, as I see we're just about out of time, is even though he has his alleged vision, Constantine actually is not going to get baptized. He actually won't get baptized till the very end of his life, over 20 years later. What's interesting is even though he'll still be minting coins, making triumphal arches, none of those mention this. Which is kind of fascinating, right? So this happened, but if that happened, why is he still, at least in arches and coins, venerating gods and goddesses? So it's an interesting question we'll get to, but it's very clear that Constantine does do some very important things for the church, regardless of what exactly is going on with the alleged vision, and will basically make some changes that will be lasting on the church for centuries and centuries. I see that we're right out of time, so we will conclude there. But I hope you've benefited from the things we've talked about today. I look forward to seeing you all next week, and I'm very excited for the chance we'll have to meet again in the fall for another class. Have a great week.